If you've ever studied Marx or even heard his name on an anti-communist podcast, you probably come across the word capital. It's a word frequently used in political economy, but it is by no means a simple concept. In this video, we will break down the various forms of capital, how it circulates, and how it is used in various spheres of the economy. Before beginning this video, we would recommend looking at our video on basic political economy so as to not get confused. There's a link to the vocabulary video in the description. Capital, by its very name, only comes about during the capitalist mode of production. The basis of such mode is rooted in the surplus value in commodities. Commodities are objects produced by labor and sold on the capitalist market. All commodities have within them both a use value, the usefulness of an object, and an exchange value, how much the commodity is worth compared to other commodities on the market. The exchange value of commodities originates from the amount of labor put into their production. Labor, too, however, is a commodity in itself. In capitalist production, the cost of labor is almost always cheaper than the value it produces, thus creating more exchange value out of nothing. The surplus value is the difference between what somebody earns for the sale of a product and what it costs to produce. Those costs include wages, materials, rent, research, taxes, and more. For example, a product sells for $100. For each unit, the capitalist has to buy $30 of wood, pay $20 of wages, $10 of taxes, and no other expenses. So the surplus value would be $40. This is the money the capitalist takes for himself at the cost of the worker. Rather than existing as a static thing, capital is both the components of and the production process for surplus value. Due to the circulatory nature of the system, capital must always be in motion. The cycle in which it passes through contains three phases: exchange, production, and finally exchange again. The first exchange phase is when the capitalist purchases means of production and labor power. With his initial revenues, he purchases the commodities necessary for production in his particular industry. On screen is a diagram of this process. M stands for money, C for commodities, MOP for means of production, and LF for labor force. The production phase of capital is the phase in which the capitalist employs the commodities he purchased in the process of material production. During this phase, the value of raw materials is instantly transferred into the commodities, just as the value of machines, plants, and tools is gradually transferred as said articles are worn down. Additionally, the labor of the workers required to produce the commodities is transformed into a new value. In this diagram, PC means production capital. The main function of this production capital is maximizing the amount of surplus value and thus the amount of profit. After commodities pass through this stage, the finished products are again relegated to the second exchange phase. This is when the capitalist takes the commodities produced from the previous phase and sells them out on the market to consumers, the capital thus restarting the cycle. This circuit is known as the MCPCM circuit, or the circuit of capital. It is important to note that at any given time, capitalists must have capital invested in all sections of the cycle. He always has some cash on hand, some raw materials in storage, some production occurring, and some commodities on the market ready for sale. In all of these states, however, his capital is constantly in motion, constantly producing more surplus value, and constantly reinforcing the poverty of the industrial laborer. While capital appears to create wealth through the process of commodity exchange, it actually relies on the exploitation of labor in order to generate profit. In the process of buying and selling commodities, money is used as a means of exchange to acquire other commodities that can be sold at a higher price. However, the value of commodities is determined by the labor required to produce them, and thus the profit gained from their sale ultimately comes from the surplus value extracted from workers who are paid less than the value they produce. This creates a contradiction between the use of money as an exchange and the exploitation of labor as a source of profit. As capital accumulates and competition increases, capitalists must find a way to increase productivity and reduce labor costs, leading to further exploitation and alienation of workers. The lack of organized production in the capitalist system often backfires on the system itself because of the rising rate of production due to innovation and the relatively falling wages of workers due to exploitation. There forms a contradiction between total social production and total social consumption. When this contradiction goes unresolved, there occurs a massive economic crisis in which producers aren't able to sell their goods and the cycle of capital is halted. Said crises are only furthered by the use of the credit system, and it increases the opportunities for overinvestment in the industry. Furthermore, the loaning of credit and the collaboration of the bank and industrial bourgeoisie speeds up the accumulation of capital into smaller and smaller hands. Overall, the contradictions inherent in the practical application of the capitalist system demonstrate the fundamental flaws of the system itself. The turnover of capital refers to the rotation of capital through the aforementioned cycle, which is a periodically renewed and repeated process. The period of turnover capital is the sum of the time of production and the time of circulation. How long this takes affects the amount of surplus value that capitalists can extract from workers in a given time. A faster turnover allows capitalists to exploit more workers in a year, obviously resulting in more surplus value. This too also affects the size of the circulating capital laid out for buying new raw material, fuel, and auxiliary materials. The acceleration of the turnover of capital is in the interest of capitalists, as it enables them to obtain the same amount of surplus value with a smaller capital, or with the same capital to obtain a larger sum of surplus value. However, accelerating the circulation of capital does not create new value, but only allows capitalists to hire a larger number of workers whose labor creates a larger amount of surplus value per year. The time of turnover capital consists of the time of production and the time of circulation. The capitalist tries to shorten both of these. They strive to shorten the duration of the working period necessary for the production of commodities as the productive forces develop and technique grows. The capitalist brings about an acceleration in the turnover of capital by shortening the time of circulation of capital. They also resort to lengthening the working day and intensifying labor and making use of improved organization and trade and development of transport, postal, and telegraph services to shorten the time of circulation. The surplus value created during a period passes through circulation along with the circulating capital. The shorter the period of turnover of capital, the more quickly the surplus value created by the workers is realized in money form, and the more quickly it can be used to extend production. Under capitalism, surplus value is used to accumulate capital, which originates from the exploitation of workers' unpaid labor. The amount of accumulation depends on the size of surplus value and is promoted by the increased exploitation, growing productivity, and the lower cost of consumer goods and means of production. The more capital is advanced, the greater the accumulation. However, this process leads to an intensification of exploitation and contradictions in the capitalist system. Capital accumulation takes two forms, concentration and centralization, which have led to the emergence of monopolies and imperialism. Technical progress and the growth of organic composition of capital have intensified the exploitation of workers and increased the army of unemployed, leading to growing class antagonisms in capitalist society. Marx formulated the general law of capitalist accumulation, which predicts a relative and absolute deterioration of the condition of the proletariat. Under contemporary conditions, only the top echelons of the monopoly bourgeoisie can accumulate capital independently, while the middle and petty bourgeoisie become more dependent on monopolies. Capitalism is a society without a future, with its basic contradiction being intensified. Concentration of capital refers to the process by which capital becomes concentrated in the hands of a few large capitalists or corporations through mergers, acquisitions, and other forms of corporate expansion. This process leads to the appearance of monopolies, which dominate certain markets and can exert control over prices and production. Centralization of capital, on the other hand, refers to the process by which capital becomes centralized in certain regions or sectors of the economy. This can occur through the concentration of industrial production in certain regions, the growth of financial centers in specific cities, and the development of certain industries at the expense of others. Expanded reproduction refers to the process in which capitalists use a part of their surplus value to invest in the purchase of additional means of production and the hiring of additional workers, with the aim of increasing the scale of production. The accumulation of capital, which involves the transformation of a part of the surplus value into capital, is necessary for the expanded reproduction to take place. Surplus value is generated through the exploitation of the working class, and capitalists seek to accumulate more of it to expand production and increase profits. If the capitalist personally consumes all the surplus value by his workers, he'll be able to keep making that same amount of money for the rest of his career. Although that may sound like a fine idea to some, a great many members of the bourgeoisie are greedy and driven by economic competition, enough to always want more. To obtain that, they must reinvest a portion of their surplus value back into the process of production. That way, increased capital amounts of the next year would generate an even greater surplus value. The year after that, it would be even bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, until he becomes so rich that who knows what will happen. This process of recirculating surplus value into productive capital is known as expanded reproduction.
Here's a diagram of how ideally this process would work.
After the original process of production is completed, the capitalist divides his own surplus value into two categories, that for his own consumption and that for reinvestment. In order to maintain the original organic composition in the next cycle, he must divide the value reinvested on the same ratio as the last cycle. With the increased amounts of capital from surplus value, the output of next year's production cycle will be even greater. The year after this, the next, and the next, the capitalist cycles more and more capital back into the process of production. If he is able to expand his business well, he'll slowly but surely rise to the top of his industry. Yet if he fails to do so, he'll one day be forced to close up shop and join the ranks of the proletariat. Despite the risks it poses to individual capitalists, the harm expanded reproduction does to the proletariat is tenfold. As wealth concentrates in one hand and poverty in the other, class contradictions intensify. The accumulation of capital is driven by two primary motives: the desire to increase surplus value and the competitive struggle between capitalists. Capitalists seek to accumulate more surplus value to intensify their personal desires and expand production, while competition among capitalists forces them to continually improve their techniques and extend production. Expanded reproduction requires a continuous accumulation of capital, which is achieved by continually increasing production and exploiting more workers and to generate more surplus value. The extended reproduction of the capitalist system results in the reproduction of capitalist production relations on an extended basis, perpetuating the cycle of exploitation and the cycle of accumulation. Constant capital is the part of capital that purchases material means of production, raw materials, auxiliary materials, and instruments of labor. The part of advanced capital that does not expand its value in production. Variable capital, for the portion of capital is expended in wages for the purchase of labor power, the part of advanced capital that expands its value in production. The organic composition of capital refers to the ratio between the means of production, constant capital, and the value of labor power, variable capital. This ratio reflects the technical composition of capital, which is the relationship between the means of production and labor power. The technical composition of capital changes to technological advancements, which leads to changes in the organic composition of capital. The organic composition of capital steadily increases as the capitalist mode of production advances, resulting in the growing exploitation of wage labor and the worsening condition of the proletariat. Today, the organic composition of capital is affected by the scientific and technological revolution, which leads to contradictory tendencies in the composition of capital. Higher expenses for skilled labor and technical labor have an impact on the organic composition of capital. The increase in the organic composition of capital leads to a higher rate of surplus value, more relative surplus production, growing unemployment, and a deterioration in the condition of the proletariat. In this diagram, C represents constant capital and V represents variable capital. As the variable capital decreases, the constant capital increases. This enhances the exploitation of the workers. An increase in the organic composition of capital leads to higher profits. However, eventually this creates hardships for the workers, who will need their wages in order to buy commodities from other capitalists. When the organic composition of capital decreases, the variable capital is larger in proportion to constant capital. The workers' wages are high, and this lowers the profit for the capitalists in turn, whose objective goal is to extract as much surplus value as possible. Fixed capital is the part of capital investment which loses its value due to wear and tear produced through prolonged and repeated labor cycles. The value of fixed capital is transferred to produce commodities bit by bit. Circulating capital is the part of capital investment which loses its value entirely during the production process and needs to be renewed after every production cycle. The value of circulating capital is transferred entirely onto produced commodities. A commercial enterprise is somewhere commodities aren't manufactured, but rather sold. Since industrialists can't efficiently sell commodities for themselves, he must first sell his commodities not to consumers, but to the commercial enterprises which interact with them. How exactly do these commercial enterprises generate a profit? Due to their monopoly on distribution, commercial capitalists had the power to buy commodities from industrialists below the actual production price, known as C plus B plus average profit, of those said commodities. In addition to purchasing the products themselves, commercial capitalists must also pay their workers to operate the store. Commercial profit is generated through the difference between purchase and sale prices of industrial commodities, subtracting the wages. Although industrial capitalists are mostly self-sufficient in financing their own operations, sometimes they too need some financial help. For this, they turn to the banks. By amassing a large amount of money from deposits and interests, banks can give loans to individuals and businesses that will help them finance an industrial or personal project. After a set amount of time, the trustee of the loan repays a slightly larger amount back, with the difference collected known as interest. Bank profit is generated both through the direct exploitation of industrial workers, by collecting interest off their own loans, and through indirect exploitation of them through receiving a share of the industrial profit paid to the bank in interest. Bank capital is the money owed to banks and the money that they borrow from the customers. The banks lend this money out to active capitalists, which they can make a profit from through charging higher interest rates on the loans than they pay on their own deposits. Bank capital has evolved from being an intermediary for payments into being a central force in the economy. Despite the fact that agricultural capital is very similar to industrial capital due to their shared productive nature, there are still some unique features that it holds. Firstly, due to the monopolistic private ownership of agricultural land, capital doesn't freely transfer between agriculture and industry. As such, the agricultural sector doesn't have to follow the industrial rate of profit. Different qualities of land will yield different crop outputs. As society usually needs to farm all of the land it has, the rate of profit within agriculture is equalized among the different cases of land. In practice, this is conducted through private landowners charging a heftier fee to grow crops and raise animals on a higher quality land. This process is known as differential rent. Two forms of differential rent exist. The first type of differential rent is based upon the fertility of the land and its location. The second type of differential rent is based upon the investment in the land by the agricultural capitalist. An example of differential rent 1 would be that there are two pieces of land, A and B, with different levels of fertility. Land A is highly fertile and can produce a high yield of crops, while land B is less fertile and can only produce a lower yield. Suppose the market price for a crop is $10 per bushel. A farmer can produce 10 bushels of a crop on land A and 5 bushels of the crop on land B. If the landlord charges the same rent per acre for both lands, the farmer on land A will make a higher profit than the farmer on land B, because the higher productivity of land A, to compensate for the lower yield on land B, the landlord may charge a lower rent per acre for land B than on land A, while still maintaining the same rate of profit. As a result, the farmer on land A pays a higher rent per acre than the farmer on land B, even though both farmers produce the same quantity of crops. This difference in rent is paid by the two farmers as differential rent 1, which arises from the unequal distribution of fertility or productivity of land. An example of differential rent 2 is when a farmer invests in improving the fertility of the land by adding fertilizers, irrigation systems, or other inputs. As a result of these investments, the farmer may be able to increase the productivity of the land and produce a higher yield than the other farmers who do not make the similar investments. If the land is owned by a landlord, The farmer may have to pay a higher rent to the landlord as a result of the increased productivity of the land, as it is a result of the investments made by the farmer rather than the inherent qualities of the land itself. In this scenario, the landlord benefits from the investments made by the farmer without contributing any labor themselves. At the same time, bad farmland does not produce any differential rent. Instead, due to the monopolization of land ownership, creates absolute rent. Even if a landlord had the worst land possible, they would still never rent it for free. If agricultural capitalists who operate bad land must obtain profit to pay rent to the landlord, they find a different way of doing so. In capitalism, the agricultural technology is always less developed than factory or manufacturing technology, allowing the organic composition of agricultural capital to always be lower than that of the organic composition of industrial capital. In other words, industrial capital is heavier than an agricultural capital. The industrial capitalist must sell his products at a production price because of the equalization of industries, and the agricultural capitalist always sells his product higher than the production price, as agricultural capital is not bound by the general rate of profit. And this allows the agricultural capitalist to produce more profit than the industrial capitalist. The difference between rate of profit in agriculture and the general rate of profit represents absolute rent. This allows the landlord to extract more surplus value from the rented land. Let's say there is a landlord who owns a large piece of farmland that is located in a remote and barren area with poor soil quality. Due to its poor quality, the land cannot produce a differential rent, which means that it is not more productive than the other similar lands in the area. However, due to the monopoly of power of the landlord over this land, they are still able to charge a rent for its use. Now let's assume that two farmers who are interested in using this land to cultivate crops, Farmer A and Farmer B. Farmer A is an industrial capitalist who runs a factory and has a high organic composition of capital. Farmer B, on the other hand, is an agricultural capitalist who operates with lower technology and has lower organic composition of capital. Since the organic composition of agricultural capital is always lower than that of the industrial capital, Farmer B will not be able to sell their crops at a higher price than the production price and make a profit. This difference between the rate of profit in agriculture and the general rate of profit represents absolute rent, which is what the landlord extracts from Farmer B. Even though the land is not productive enough to generate a differential rent, the landlord can still extract a surplus rent from Farmer B due to the monopoly of power over the land. Farmer A, who has a higher organic composition of capital, cannot afford to pay such a high rent and therefore would not be interested in using this land. But for Farmer B, the surplus rent paid as well as the absolute rent is still less than the profits they can make from cultivating crops on the land, so it remains a profitable venture for them. Here's a diagram of good versus bad land and rent in the agricultural capitalist system. Notice how in both forms of rent, the landlord doesn't have to do much, but owns inherited land.
If you think you grasped the concepts in this video, then take the following questions and answer in the comments. Now, compare your answers to the ones on screen. Thank you for watching the video. Share it with your friends and make sure to subscribe to the channel and join our Discord. We also have a website with many high-quality articles on WordPress, and we appreciate the support given. We will see you in our next video on imperialism. In the meantime, feel free to explore our other videos and leave your comments and suggestions below. Thank you again for watching, and we look forward to seeing you soon.